I am Elara. I am 32 years old, and a little over a month ago, the people who brought me into this world orchestrated a lavish, formal birthday banquet for the sole, calculated purpose of publicly destroying me. They gathered 56 relatives, ranging from immediate family to distant cousins I had not laid eyes on since childhood. They booked the grand, vaulted private dining hall at the most exclusive historical club in the city. I walked through those heavy oak doors genuinely believing, against my better judgment, that I was stepping into a surprise celebration of my life. I walked out of those doors an entirely different person. But before I pull apart the intricate, rotting threads of that evening, there is something you must understand. My parents were completely certain they held all the cards. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that they were not the only ones who had arrived with a meticulously crafted strategy. And the quiet, unassuming woman sitting in the shadows of the far corner, the aunt my parents had systematically erased from our bloodline 2 decades prior, had been patiently waiting for this exact moment to strike. Before I take you back to that devastating night, please take a quiet moment to settle in. If you find that the painful realities of toxic family dynamics and the desperate pursuit of self-worth resonate with your own journey, let me know. I always find comfort in knowing where my listeners are tuning in from. Drop your current location and the time of day in the comments. We are a community of survivors, and I love knowing where you all are. Now, let me wind the clock back 4 weeks to the specific phone call that set this entire avalanche in motion. I was standing at my workbench, my hands coated in fine brass dust and specialized lubricating oil. I am a horologist. I painstakingly restore antique clocks. My workshop always smells of aged walnut wood, metallic polish, and dark roasted coffee. The air is perpetually filled with the comforting, overlapping heartbeats of 100 ticking mechanisms. I was in the delicate process of adjusting a fragile escapement wheel when my cell phone vibrated violently against the wooden bench. I almost ignored it. Then I glanced at the glowing screen and saw the name. Mother. Beatrice did not make phone calls. She was a woman who communicated strictly through brief, icy text messages that read more like military directives than maternal check-ins. So, when her name illuminated my screen, a strange, cold knot formed in the pit of my stomach. I carefully wiped my oily hands on my heavy canvas apron and answered the call. Elara. Her voice flowed through the speaker, dripping with a smooth, honeyed sweetness that was entirely unnatural. It was almost warm. That was my very first blaring warning siren. I sincerely hope I am not interrupting your little tinkering hobby. I am working on a commission, Mother, I replied, keeping my voice neutral. What is going on? Your father and I have been having some very deep conversations lately, she continued, deliberately pausing to let the weight of her words hang in the air. We have decided that it is long overdue for the entire family to come together to properly celebrate your 32nd birthday. I nearly dropped the phone onto the concrete floor. In my entire 32 years of existence, Beatrice had never once referred to my birthday as a special occasion. Most years, the date slipped by completely unacknowledged. On my 20th birthday, I had waited in my small apartment all day, staring at the phone. Not a single call came. Not from her, not from my father, Julian, and certainly not from my older sister, Vivian. A family dinner? I heard myself whisper, the disbelief evident. For my birthday? The entire extended family is flying in. They all desperately want to see you, Elara, her tone sharpened, just a fraction of an inch, revealing the steel beneath the honey. Do not be late. This Saturday, 7 o'clock in the evening. The Obsidian Room. The Obsidian Room. It was the most notoriously expensive, exclusive private dining club in the metropolitan area. It was the exact venue my parents had rented out to proudly announce Vivian's partnership at her corporate law firm. It was the stage they used to celebrate the things that actually held value to them. I will be there, I said quietly. Excellent, she replied, and the line went dead. I stood alone in my ticking workshop, the phone still pressed tightly against my ear, listening to the hollow silence of the disconnected call. My hands were visibly trembling, leaving dark, oily smudges across the glass screen of my phone. Every instinct inside my body was screaming that something was deeply wrong, that I was walking into a trap. But hope is a treacherous, stubborn, foolish thing. It whispered softly in the back of my mind. Maybe they have finally softened. Maybe the passage of time has changed them. Maybe, just this once, it will be different. I should have listened to the warning bells. Exactly 2 days later, Vivian unexpectedly materialized at my workshop. She had never stepped foot inside my studio. Not a single time in the 4 years since I had signed the lease. But there she was, standing rigidly in the doorway, wearing an immaculate, tailored designer suit, looking around at the scattered gears and antique grandfather clocks as if she had accidentally stepped into a toxic landfill. "Quaint little space you have here," she remarked. It was definitively not a compliment. "What do you want, Vivian?" I asked, not bothering to set down my precision screwdriver. She walked over to a nearby table, picked up a polished brass pendulum, inspected it with clear disdain, and carelessly dropped it back down. I have been thinking a lot about the Silverwood estate lately. And there it was. The absolute, unvarnished truth hiding behind the sudden family reunion. "The sprawling mountain chalet is not on the market, Vivian," I said firmly. "It is just sitting up there in the mountains, Elara," she snapped, finally making direct eye contact with me. "It is completely empty, while my law firm is demanding massive capital buy-ins that I cannot currently afford." "Grandmother left that estate entirely to me," I reminded her. That was her legally binding decision. Vivian's jaw clenched so hard I thought her teeth might crack. "Grandmother is dead, Elara. She does not need a massive mountain retreat anymore. But I desperately need liquid capital. The family needs that money to maintain our standing." I placed my tools down on the leather mat, moving with slow, deliberate precision to mask my rising anger. That estate is the place where grandmother taught me how to take apart my very first pocket watch. It is the place where I felt safe. It is not just a piece of disposable real estate to me. "God, you are so pathetically sentimental," she sneered, rolling her eyes toward the ceiling. "This is exactly why mother and father," she abruptly cut herself off, pressing her lips together. "Why mother and father what?" I challenged, stepping closer. She forced a smile. That perfectly practiced, terrifyingly blank smile she used to intimidate opposing counsel in the boardroom. "Nothing. Forget I said anything. Just make sure you actually show up to the dinner on Saturday. Mother has very specific plans." The word hung heavily in the dusty air between us. "Plans." I repeated the word slowly, tasting the malice in it. She was already turning on her expensive heels, walking toward the exit. "See you there, little sister. Make sure you wear something presentable for once. The entire family will be watching you." The door clicked shut behind her, leaving me alone in the comforting, rhythmic ticking of my clocks. But my heart was beating in a completely different, erratic rhythm. The entire family will be watching. Plans. What kind of psychological ambush had I just agreed to walk into? That night, sleep completely evaded me. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my mind constantly circling back to the Silverwood estate and to grandmother Eleanor. She was the only human being in my entire bloodline who ever made me feel like my existence was not a burden. I was 14 years old the first summer my parents shipped me off to her mountain chalet. They told her I was far too difficult to manage, that I lacked ambition, that I needed strict isolation. I arrived at her doorstep furious, sullen, and fully prepared to hate every second of my exile. But grandmother Eleanor did not try to correct me. She did not try to mold me into a corporate prodigy. She simply led me into her dusty, sunlit workshop, placed a broken, 19th century carriage clock in front of me, and handed me a set of tiny screwdrivers. "You have patience in your hands, Elara," she had told me, her voice gentle over the sound of the wind whistling through the pine trees outside. "You know how to listen to what is broken and figure out how to make it sing again. That is a rare, beautiful gift that your parents will never possess the capacity to understand." It was the very first time in my life that anyone had ever referred to an aspect of my personality as a gift. Not a flaw, not a disappointment, not a problem to be eradicated. A gift. Every single summer after that, I begged to go back to the mountains. We spent endless hours restoring complex mechanisms side by side. We drank dark tea on the massive wooden wraparound porch at sunrise. We talked about the philosophy of time, about life, about everything and absolutely nothing. When I opened my very first restoration shop at the age of 25, she was the only member of my family who attended the opening reception. She sat in a chair near the front window, tears pooling in her wise, lined eyes, clapping with such fierce pride that her hands turned pink. 7 months ago, she passed away quietly in her sleep. It was peaceful, the doctors said, as if her internal clock had simply wound down to its final tick. In her ironclad will, she explicitly left me the Silverwood estate, along with a heavily carved mahogany box that I had not yet found the emotional strength to open. Lying in bed the night before the birthday dinner, the crushing weight of her absence threatened to suffocate me. I finally understood exactly what had been stolen from me when she died. It was not just the loss of a grandparent. It was the loss of my only living witness, the only proof I had ever been loved. Without Eleanor, I was entirely alone in a family of wolves. Or at least, that is what I believed in the dark. I had absolutely no idea that someone else had been quietly observing the wolves from the tree line for decades. The suffocating pressure campaign had officially begun 3 days before the dinner. Initially, it was insidious and subtle. A text message from my cousin Clara appeared on my screen. "Hey, just heard the amazing news that you might be selling the mountain estate to help the family fund. That is so incredibly generous of you." I stared at the message. I wasn't selling anything. Who was feeding her this narrative? Then my father called. Julian's voice was as cold and hard as polished marble. "Your mother is severely distressed, Elara." I gripped the edges of my workbench. Distressed about what, exactly? The estate, obviously. You know damn well what this is about. He let out a long, heavy, profoundly disappointed sigh. It was the exact sigh that had soundtracked every failure of my childhood. "We have given you absolutely everything. We tolerated your bizarre obsession with old clocks, even when your lack of a real career humiliated us in our social circles. And now, when your sister desperately needs liquid assets to secure her future, you stubbornly refuse to help your own blood. Grandmother legally left the chalet to me, Julian," I stated firmly, refusing to call him Dad. It was her property and her final choice. "Legal wills can easily be contested in court," he countered, his voice dropping into a dark, deliberate threat. "But loyalty to one's family shouldn't have to be forced by a judge." The heavy implication hung suspended in the air. I felt my chest tighten uncomfortably. Was I actually being selfish? It was the toxic question they had programmed into my brain since birth. Vivian's corporate ambitions were stalling without a massive cash injection. My parents had already liquidated significant assets to fund her Ivy League education and her lavish lifestyle. And here I was, the disappointing clockmaker, sitting on a pristine piece of mountain real estate valued at over $2 million. But every single time I seriously considered caving to their demands, I heard grandmother Eleanor's steady voice echoing in my memory. "Promise me, my sweet girl. Promise me you will never let them make you shrink yourself to fit into their tiny boxes." If you truly cared about the survival of this family, Julian continued relentlessly, you would do the honorable thing. Show up to the dinner tomorrow night. We will sit down and discuss the asset transfer like reasonable adults. And what happens if I absolutely refuse to sell? I asked quietly. A thick, suffocating silence followed. Then I suppose your mother and I will finally know exactly where your loyalties lie, and we will act accordingly. He terminated the call. I sat alone in the dark of my workshop for hours that night, running the brutal mathematics of my life. If I surrendered and signed away the mountain estate, I would lose the absolute last physical piece of my grandmother. If I stood my ground and kept the house, I would permanently lose my parents and my sister. But somewhere deep in the recesses of my soul, a quiet, rebellious voice asked a dangerous question. Have you ever actually possessed their love in the first place? You cannot lose what you never truly had. The evening before the dinner, I walked into my bedroom and pulled the dress from the back of my closet. It was a stunning, floor-length gown made of heavy, deep forest green velvet with delicate, intricate gold embroidery tracing the neckline. Grandmother Eleanor had commissioned it for my 21st birthday. I want you to wear this on the days you need to feel like an absolute queen, she had told me. I had not taken it off the hanger since the morning of her funeral. I laid the heavy velvet across my bedspread and stared down at it. I was desperately trying to mentally manipulate myself into believing that tomorrow would somehow be acceptable. That my parents genuinely wanted to celebrate my existence. That Vivian's chilling comment about plans was just her usual arrogant bluster. Suddenly, my phone vibrated sharply on the nightstand. It was a text message from an entirely unknown number. The message was incredibly brief. Do not go to the obsidian room tomorrow night. It is a psychological slaughterhouse. It is not what you think. My heart skipped a violent beat. I immediately typed a response. Who is this? How do you know about the dinner? 3 animated gray dots appeared, signaling a reply was being typed. Then, they vanished. Nothing. When I frantically tried to call the number, an automated voice informed me that the line had already been permanently disconnected. I sat heavily on the edge of my mattress, my pulse roaring in my ears. Was it a cruel prank by one of my cousins? A wrong number? Or a genuine warning from a ghost? My eyes slowly drifted toward the intricately carved mahogany box resting on my bedside table. Grandmother's box. The one I had been far too emotionally fragile to open since the lawyers handed it to me. With trembling fingers, I reached out and slowly lifted the heavy wooden lid. Inside, resting on a bed of faded red silk, was a handwritten letter, neatly folded into perfect thirds. And tucked directly beneath the parchment was an old, slightly yellowed Polaroid photograph. It featured 2 vibrant young women standing shoulder to shoulder on the porch of the Silverwood estate, throwing their heads back in genuine laughter. One of the women was unmistakably my mother, Beatrice, looking 30 years younger and remarkably carefree. The other woman, who shared my mother's sharp cheekbones and dark eyes, was a complete stranger to me. I had never seen her face in a single family photo album. I carefully unfolded the delicate letter. It was written in Grandmother Eleanor's elegant, sweeping script. It was shaky, clearly written near the end, but entirely legible. My dearest, brave Elara. I stopped. I physically could not read the rest of the words. Not tonight. If I read the contents of that letter, I knew with absolute certainty that I would lose whatever microscopic sliver of courage I had left to face my parents tomorrow. I desperately needed to hold on to the agonizing fantasy, just for one final day, that my family might actually possess the capacity to love me. I carefully folded the letter back up and tucked it safely into the hidden zippered pocket of my evening clutch, just in case I needed her strength. Then I hung the forest green velvet dress on the back of my bedroom door and forced myself to close my eyes. Tomorrow, the fabric of my entire reality was going to tear. I just had no idea how violent the ripping would be. The obsidian room looked entirely different under the cover of night. It was an intimidating fortress of wealth. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, casting fractured light over pristine white linen tablecloths. The atmosphere possessed that specific, heavy kind of silence that only exorbitant amounts of money can buy. I had only ever been inside this establishment twice before, and both times had been strictly to celebrate Vivian's corporate milestones. The impeccably dressed hostess offered a polished, empty smile when I softly provided my name. Ah, yes, of course. The Julian Vance party. Please follow me right this way, Miss Vance. She led me down a long, dimly lit corridor lined with somber, expensive oil portraits of wealthy men, past the crowded main dining hall, and finally stopped before a set of towering, intricately carved oak doors. Your private banquet hall, she murmured, pushing the heavy doors open with a theatrical flourish. 56 faces immediately turned in absolute unison to look at me. I froze dead in the doorway, my breath catching in my throat. I saw aunts, uncles, and cousins I had not spoken to since I was a teenager. I saw great-aunts sitting in wheelchairs and second cousins whose names I could not even recall. They completely filled a massive, U-shaped mahogany table that absolutely dominated the grand room. Every single one of them was dressed in their formal Sunday best, and every single one of them was staring at me with a heavy, oppressive intensity. My heart began to hammer violently against my ribs. This was a surprise party. It absolutely had to be. All these people had flown across the country and gathered in this room for me. But as my eyes scanned the hall, the dread began to pool in my stomach. There were no balloons. There were no banners. There was no beautifully decorated birthday cake resting on a side table. Absolutely no one yelled surprise or happy birthday. There was only a suffocating, judgmental silence and 56 pairs of eyes tracking my every movement. I spotted my parents holding court at the absolute head of the massive table. Beatrice was dripping in her signature pearls, her posture impossibly rigid. Julian wore his standard, terrifyingly blank boardroom face. Vivian sat directly to their right, aggressively swirling a glass of red wine, completely refusing to make eye contact with me. And there, positioned in the absolute center of the U-shaped table, directly facing the entrance and exposed to the entire room, was a single, lonely, empty chair. It was the seat of the accused. I forced my legs to move, walking toward it with agonizing slowness, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. I felt the physical weight of their collective gaze pressing down on my shoulders. The room was far too quiet. It felt exactly like a sterile courtroom in the agonizing minutes right before the judge delivers a guilty verdict. A sleek, black microphone stand was set up near my father's seat at the head of the table. That is when I finally noticed her. Sitting alone at a tiny, shadow-draped table in the far back corner of the room was a woman. She had elegant, gray-streaked hair pulled back into a simple, severe knot at the nape of her neck. She was watching me intently with an expression I could not decipher. She looked hauntingly familiar. It was the face from the Polaroid photograph in grandmother's box. My mother's smile suddenly snapped into place. It was the terrifying, razor-thin smile she always wore right before she went in for the kill. "Elara," she called out, gesturing grandly toward the empty chair in the center. "Please sit down. We have all been waiting for you." I had barely lowered myself onto the plush cushion of the chair when my father abruptly stood up. He reached out and picked up his champagne flute, tapping the side of it with a heavy silver spoon. Tap, tap, tap. The room, which was already dead silent, somehow grew even quieter. Every eye shifted simultaneously from me to Julian. "I want to sincerely thank every single one of you for traveling here tonight." His voice boomed through the microphone, echoing off the vaulted ceilings like he was addressing a hostile corporate takeover. "We have gathered everyone in this room tonight to address a highly critical family matter. Not to celebrate Elara. Not for my daughter's birthday. A family matter." My stomach instantly turned into a block of solid ice. "As many of you are already painfully aware," he continued, his tone turning grave and deeply disappointed, "our youngest daughter, Elara, has consistently made life choices that have deeply concerned and embarrassed this family. She completely abandoned her prestigious university education. She stubbornly refused to pursue a respectable, high-earning career path. She has chosen to live in a bizarre, chaotic manner that absolutely does not reflect the esteemed values of the Vance family name." Excited, venomous murmurs immediately rippled through the assembled crowd. I clearly heard Aunt Margaret whisper to her husband, "I always knew that girl was fundamentally broken." My father's cold, dead eyes locked onto mine. They held absolute, terrifying finality. "Beatrice and I have tried absolutely everything in our power to save her. We have offered endless patience, financial support, and strict guidance. But Elara aggressively refuses to change her nature. She refuses to honor her family obligations." My mother suddenly reached up and delicately dabbed at the corners of her dry eyes with a monogrammed silk handkerchief. It was the emotional performance of a lifetime, flawlessly executed. Therefore, Julian's voice cracked like a whip through the speakers. "As of this exact moment, tonight, we are making a formal, irrevocable declaration." He paused perfectly for dramatic effect. The entire room collectively held its breath. "Elara Vance is no longer recognized as a member of this family." The brutal words hit me with the physical force of a speeding train. Theatrical gasps scattered through the dining hall. Cousin Clara dramatically covered her mouth with both hands. Uncle Arthur slowly shook his bald head in performative sorrow. "Is this actually happening right now?" Someone whispered loudly from the back row. My mother stood up, elegantly smoothing the wrinkles from her designer skirt. "We offered her every single opportunity a child could ever dream of." Her voice trembled with perfectly practiced, agonizing maternal grief. She actively chose public shame and defiance over her own loving family. I was completely paralyzed. I couldn't move a single muscle. I couldn't draw oxygen into my lungs. 56 pairs of eyes burned into my flesh, and suddenly, I was 14 years old again. I was standing in the foyer of my parents' sprawling mansion, holding a packed suitcase, being coldly informed that I was far too difficult and broken to keep in their home. Then, moving with lethal precision, my mother reached into her expensive leather handbag and extracted a thick, folded sheaf of legal documents. She walked over and dropped the papers onto the pristine white tablecloth directly in front of me. They landed with a heavy, sickening slap. "Sign this document," my mother commanded softly, leaning over me, "and we will graciously allow you to stand up, walk out of those doors, and leave this room with whatever tiny shred of dignity you have left." I slowly lowered my eyes to the table. The black text blurred, swam, and then sharpened into terrifying focus. It was printed on the heavy, embossed letterhead of an aggressive corporate law firm. Paragraph after paragraph of dense, suffocating legal fine print. And there, waiting at the very bottom of the final page, was a stark black signature line with my full legal name typed neatly beneath it. Voluntary relinquishment and transfer of inheritance rights, the Silverwood Estate. This was entirely about the Mountain Estate. It had always been about the estate. Every single confusing event of the past month instantly clicked into place with sickening clarity. The out-of-character birthday invitation. Vivian's sudden appearance at my shop. The vague references to family loyalty. The 56 relatives assembled in their finest clothes. They had absolutely no intention of throwing a party to disown me. They had gone through the massive expense and effort of gathering the entire extended family to stage a high-pressure psychological ambush. They wanted to terrorize me into signing away grandmother Eleanor's home. The grand, theatrical disownment was nothing more than calculated leverage, a brutal play designed to shatter my mind and force compliance. "You meticulously planned this entire spectacle," I breathed, my voice barely audible over the roaring in my ears. "We carefully planned an intervention," my mother corrected me, her voice as smooth as glass. "For your own ultimate good." I frantically scanned the room and spotted a man wearing an ill-fitting gray suit standing near the exit doors. It was Mr. Sterling, my parents' ruthless personal attorney. He was already holding a heavy brass notary stamp in his sweaty hand, fully prepared to instantly legalize my surrender. My mother leaned in closer, the suffocating smell of her expensive, heavy floral perfume invading my nostrils. 56 witnesses, Elara, she whispered, her tone venomous. "Your grandmother's estate lawyer will never, ever be able to successfully argue against a document signed in front of this level of unified family consensus." She aggressively tapped the thick paper with one perfectly manicured, crimson fingernail. "Sign the paper. Walk away quietly into the night." This absolutely does not have to be any harder than it already is. The grand hall waited in suffocating silence. I could physically feel the weight of their predatory stares. Some looked at me with pathetic pity, some with naked contempt, and some with the grotesque, morbid curiosity of people slowing down to stare at a fatal car crash. My hands were violently trembling in my lap. My peripheral vision was beginning to darken. They had deliberately twisted my 32nd birthday into a brutal corporate tribunal, and I was already pronounced guilty. But somewhere deep beneath the crushing layers of panic and childhood trauma, a different kind of energy began to stir. Something much harder. Something forged in the fires of survival. I suddenly thought of grandmother Eleanor's unopened letter, resting quietly inside the clutch in my lap. I thought of the mysterious, gray-haired woman sitting alone in the dark corner, patiently watching. My mother impatiently nudged a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen across the tablecloth toward me. "Sign it," she hissed. "Right now." I reached out and let my trembling fingers brush against the cold metal of the pen. I know, right now, as you listen to this, you are probably burning with the exact same furious rage I felt in that horrific moment. The gold pen hovering over my own execution order, 56 blood relatives silently demanding my compliance, and my own mother's cold, dead eyes drilling into my skull like I was a broken mechanism to be discarded. If you have ever been treated like a disposable tool instead of a human being by the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally, please type "I understand" in the comments right now. And if you desperately want to know exactly how I tore their perfect plan to shreds, drop a like to let me know you are still walking this path with me. Now, let us go back to the obsidian room. My fingers loosely gripped the heavy gold pen. It hovered just millimeters above the crisp white paper. "Sign the damn document, Elara," my mother's eyes demanded silently. "End this miserable charade." But a sudden, inexplicable instinct forced me to lift my head. I didn't look at Beatrice. I didn't look at Julian. I looked out at the massive room. 56 faces stared back at me in hungry anticipation. The vast majority of them I barely knew. They were distant, peripheral characters who only materialized at funerals to drink free wine, or mailed generic holiday cards that went straight into the trash. They had been intentionally summoned here tonight to serve as weapons of intimidation. And then, my gaze found her again. The mysterious woman in the far back corner. Her gray-streaked hair was pulled back securely. She wore a completely unadorned, simple black dress that made absolutely no attempt to impress the wealthy snobs in the room. She was sitting entirely apart from the chaotic pack, half concealed by the shadows of a massive potted fern. She was not looking at me with the smug contempt or sickening pity of the others. She was staring directly into my eyes, and her expression was projecting a very clear, urgent message. Stay completely calm. Just wait. I watched as her hands rested casually on top of a worn, brown leather satchel resting in her lap. The bag looked unnaturally bulky, stuffed to the brim with heavy files, or perhaps something much more devastating. My mother, sensing the shift in my attention, followed my line of sight. Her head snapped sharply toward the dark corner of the room, and for the absolute first time in my entire life, I saw a genuine, unfiltered emotion violently flicker across Beatrice's perfectly Botoxed face. Absolute, unadulterated terror. The mask slipped for only a fraction of a second before she rapidly smoothed it over with practiced, desperate control. But I had seen it. The crack in the armor. Elara. My mother's voice was pure, freezing ice now. Stop stalling. Focus your eyes here. Sign the paper. Who is this woman? Why did my mother, a woman who feared absolutely nothing and nobody on earth, look at a stranger in a cheap black dress as if she had just seen the devil himself? And why did the stranger's sharp cheekbones feel like I was looking at a distorted, older mirror image of my own mother? Elara. It was my father's voice this time, booming through the microphone, vibrating with barely contained rage. We are all losing our patience. I slowly set the heavy gold pen down on the tablecloth. I did not sign the document. Not yet. Can I please have 1 single minute? I asked, projecting my voice to sound small and fragile. Just a moment to collect my thoughts? My mother's terrifying smile returned, tight and victorious. Of course you can, my darling. Take a breath. But her panicked eyes repeatedly darted back toward the woman in the shadows. The sheer pressure of the massive room pressed against my chest. The cruel whispers, the hateful stares, the unbearable weight of 56 individual judgments. But cutting through the chaotic noise of my own panic, I heard another voice. It was soft, familiar, and speaking from a deep, untouched reservoir of memory inside my mind. Never let them make you shrink yourself, my sweet girl. And if they ever try to crush you, remember that you already possess absolutely everything you need to survive. Grandmother Eleanor had spoken those exact words to me the very last time I saw her alive, just 2 short weeks before her heart stopped. She had gripped my hands in hers, hands that were so terrifyingly thin and fragile by then, and looked at me with eyes that still burned with a fierce, protective fire. I left you so much more than just a mountain house, Elara. Her voice had been nothing more than a raspy whisper, but it carried the weight of absolute truth. I left you the ultimate weapon, the truth. I had not comprehended her cryptic words in that hospital room, but the puzzle pieces were finally beginning to forcefully lock into place. Beneath the absolute cover of the tablecloth, my left hand slipped silently into my evening clutch. My trembling fingers quickly found the sharp paper edge of the envelope. Grandmother's letter. Still unread. Still waiting. I had been far too terrified to open it the night before, too desperate to cling to the pathetic delusion that this banquet might actually be born of love. That pathetic delusion was nothing but ash now. Whatever devastating secrets were contained within that letter, Eleanor had desperately wanted me to have them for a reason. She had known the dark truths about my mother. She had known exactly what this family was capable of, and precisely what horrific lengths they would go to once she was safely buried in the ground. I looked up at the grand hall full of blood relatives who eagerly wanted me to be quietly erased. I looked at Beatrice, who had masterfully orchestrated this public execution with military precision. I looked at Julian, who was too much of a coward to even meet my gaze. And then I looked back at the woman in the corner. She was still watching me, still waiting patiently. Her hand remained resting on the leather satchel. I was not alone in this room. I didn't yet know how or why, but I was not fighting this war by myself. A profound, unbreakable resolve suddenly settled deep within the marrow of my bones. The panic instantly evaporated, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. Actually, I announced, my voice carrying a sudden, booming strength that shocked even me, I do have a few words I would like to say to everyone here. My mother's victorious smile instantly violently flickered. Say what? Give me the microphone, I demanded, standing up from the chair. My mother let out a short, sharp, entirely dismissive laugh. The microphone? Don't be absurd, Elara. This is not one of your pathetic little community theater performances. Then why on earth did you set up a professional audio system? I challenged, aggressively gesturing to the heavy metal stand positioned near my father. You meticulously planned every single detail of this ambush. The specific seating arrangements, the massive audience of witnesses, the sweaty corporate lawyer hiding in the corner, clutching a notary stamp. You desperately wanted an audience for my execution. So, kindly let me speak to them. A nervous ripple of confused murmurs washed through the dining hall. Uncle Arthur shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his leather chair squeaking loudly in the quiet room. Cousin Clara exchanged a panicked, wide-eyed glance with her husband. My mother's eyes narrowed into tiny, hateful slits. This was absolutely not the script she had written, and she despised improvisation. Fine, she snapped, her voice instantly morphing back into that sickening, performative honey, but before you speak, let us make absolutely certain that every single person in this room fully understands exactly who they are dealing with. She abruptly straightened her spine and turned to address the room, adopting the commanding posture of a ruthless prosecutor delivering a devastating closing argument to a jury. My youngest daughter was handed every single opportunity this world has to offer on a silver platter. We offered to fully fund her Ivy League medical school tuition. She threw it in our faces. We offered her a highly lucrative position managing the administration of our family's medical practice. She aggressively refused. She chose to play around with greasy gears and broken clocks in a filthy basement instead. Someone in the back row let out a cruel, mocking snicker. I couldn't see their face. Her very first clock restoration exhibition? My mother's voice dripped with theatrical, agonizing pity. Exactly 3 people bothered to attend. 3. And one of them was a homeless man who wandered in off the street looking for free alcohol. A wave of humiliating heat violently rushed to my face. That tiny, failed exhibition had taken place over 8 years ago. I had cried myself to sleep for an entire week afterward, and she had meticulously saved that painful memory, preserving it in amber, specifically to weaponize my lowest moment and use it to destroy me tonight. And when she was 23 years old, my mother continued relentlessly, her voice rising in volume to ensure the entire room heard her, desperate, entirely broke, and facing eviction. Do any of you know what she did? She came crawling back to our doorstep, sobbing and begging us for a massive financial handout. She dramatically turned her body to face me, absolute, unadulterated triumph burning in her cold eyes. She has always been the incredibly weak one. She is hopelessly emotional, highly unstable, and entirely incapable of managing her own life. Is this pathetic, broken girl really the person you want viciously clinging to Eleanor's multi-million-dollar estate? My eyes burned with unshed tears, but I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper. I would absolutely not cry. Not in this room. not for their entertainment, and certainly not for her. Are you completely finished? I asked quietly, my voice eerily calm. My mother offered a brilliant, terrifying smile. Sweetheart, I am only just getting started. She had absolutely no idea. So was I. That is the exact moment Vivian decided to stand up. My older sister, the flawless golden child, the one who received absolutely everything I was violently denied, the endless praise, the massive financial support, the unshakable belief that she was destined for greatness. She dramatically pressed her hand flat against her chest, wearing a practiced expression of exquisite, heartbreaking sorrow. I really tried, she announced to the room, her voice trembling beautifully. I really, genuinely tried to help her. The entire room hung on her every word. I visited her filthy little workshop just last week. Vivian wiped an invisible tear from her cheek. I gently asked if we could sit down and discuss grandmother's estate to find a loving family compromise. And do you all want to know what my own sister told me? She paused. The timing was absolutely impeccable. She had learned the dark art of theatrical manipulation directly from Beatrice. She looked me dead in the eye and said that grandmother's pile of wood meant significantly more to her than the survival of her own flesh and blood. Loud, dramatic gasps echoed through the vaulted room. Aunt Margaret violently clicked her tongue against her teeth in extreme disapproval. That is absolutely not what I said to you, I interjected, my voice cutting through the noise. It is exactly what you meant. Vivian shot back, her sorrow instantly vanishing, replaced by cold, triumphant malice. You have always cared significantly more about hoarding broken objects than you have about human beings. That is exactly why you will always be utterly alone. I stared at her in shock. My older sister, the sibling I had fiercely protected from ruthless playground bullies when we were young. The girl I had consistently covered for when she was sneaking out of the house to drink at 16. The sister I had foolishly believed was just tragically caught in the terrible crossfire of our parents' psychological warfare. The truth finally shattered the illusion. She was not caught in the middle. She was an active, willing participant. She had absolutely helped them meticulously plan this entire psychological execution. Do you all finally see the truth? My mother dramatically spread her arms wide, gesturing to the crowd. We were left with absolutely no other choice. This public intervention is entirely for her own ultimate good, Julian firmly added, stepping up beside his wife. For the good of the entire family legacy, Vivian finished smoothly. The three of them stood shoulder to shoulder at the head of the massive table. A terrifyingly united front. A perfect, flawless family that had no room for me. Uncle Arthur leaned heavily across the table, his face flushed with wine and self-importance. Maybe you should just stop being so incredibly selfish and sign the damn document, Elara. Stop making this a painful spectacle. Aunt Margaret nodded enthusiastically beside him. Think about the massive damage you are doing to your parents' pristine social reputation, she scolded. The walls of the obsidian room were rapidly closing in. The physical space was shrinking. The air was becoming impossibly thin. And then, Julian reached down, picked up the heavy gold fountain pen, and thrust it directly toward my chest. This is your absolute last chance to do the right thing, he growled. The gold pen hovered in the tense air between us. Black ink encased in a heavy silver barrel. Such a remarkably small, insignificant object to hold the entire weight of my future. Sign the paper right now, Beatrice commanded, her voice dropping to a lethal hiss, or turn around, walk out of those oak doors, and never, ever speak to a single member of this family again. 56 people completely stopped breathing. The silence was agonizing. I could clearly hear the faint clinking of ice melting in crystal water glasses. I could hear the muffled, distant chaos of the restaurant's commercial kitchen through the walls. I could hear the rapid, frantic ticking of the antique watch strapped to my wrist. I looked down at the legal document. The suffocating legal jargon swam before my eyes, but I understood the core objective perfectly. Applying my signature to that line would legally hand them the Silverwood estate. It would surrender grandmother Eleanor's home, the absolute only sanctuary on this earth where I had ever felt like a complete, worthy human being. I slowly looked up at my parents. There was absolutely zero love residing in their cold eyes. There was no hesitation, no maternal regret. There was only raw, naked impatience. They desperately wanted this transaction completed. I looked at Vivian. She was violently biting her lower lip, desperately trying to maintain her mask of tragic sorrow, but I recognized the microscopic gleam in her eyes. It was the exact look she got right before she won a massive corporate settlement. And then I turned my head and looked directly at the strange woman sitting in the shadows. She met my gaze and gave me the slightest, almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. Her hand slowly moved to unbuckle the heavy straps of her leather satchel. Something profound shifted deep inside the center of my chest. It was not exactly hope. It was something significantly harder, colder, and infinitely clearer. It was the sharp edge of truth. I thought to myself, a family built on genuine love would never, ever resort to this. I thought, Grandmother Eleanor would burn this entire room to the ground before she let them do this to me. I thought, I have spent 32 exhausting, agonizing years desperately trying to contort myself into a shape that they might finally love. What would happen if I simply stopped trying? My hand moved forward and closed tightly around the heavy gold pen. I felt its significant weight pressing against my palm. Beatrice's face instantly relaxed into a brilliant, victorious smile. Julian exhaled a massive sigh of relief. And then, with deliberate, agonizing slowness, I set the pen down on the table, far away from the document. No. The single syllable fell from my lips like a heavy boulder plunging into a still lake. What exactly did you just say? My mother whispered, her victorious smile freezing into a grotesque grimace. I said absolutely no, I repeated, my voice echoing through the silent hall. I aggressively pushed my chair back and stood up to my full height. I am absolutely not signing your extortion document. But I am definitely going to say my piece. I lunged across the table and grabbed the heavy metal microphone from its stand. Julian violently lunged forward to stop my hand, but I was significantly faster, stepping back out of his reach. You so desperately wanted an audience tonight. I spoke directly into the microphone, my amplified voice ringing out like a thunderclap through the grand room. So, please, sit back and let me give them a performance they will never forget. In that exact moment, I finally, truly understood what Grandmother Eleanor had meant. I possessed absolutely everything I needed to destroy them. The heavy metal microphone felt incredibly solid and grounding in my trembling hand. It was real. It was a weapon of truth. Beatrice's perfectly powdered face had drained of all color, turning a sickly, ashen gray. Julian was frozen in a half-standing position, visibly torn between physically charging at me or sitting down to pretend this rebellion was somehow part of his grand design. I did not grant them a single second to formulate a counterattack. Thank you all for coming tonight, I announced, my amplified voice carrying a steady, terrifying calm that shocked my own ears. I have a few vital pieces of family history that I would like to share with the group. Elara, put the microphone down right now. Beatrice commanded, her voice shrill and panicked. You have already had your turn to speak. I stared directly into her terrified eyes. No, Beatrice. Now it is my turn. The entire energetic frequency of the room violently shifted. I could physically feel the collective attention of 56 people dramatically swing toward me. I was no longer the pathetic, broken defendant awaiting my sentence. I had suddenly transformed into the prosecution, and I held the gavel. 7 months ago, my beloved grandmother, Eleanor Vance, passed away. I began, pacing slowly behind my chair. Many of you in this room knew her well. She was fiercely kind. She was boundlessly generous. She was the absolute only human being in this toxic bloodline who ever made me feel like my life actually mattered. A few of the older aunts in the crowd slowly nodded their heads in silent agreement. Eleanor had been universally respected, if not entirely understood by them. She legally left me her mountain estate. Not because I greedily asked for it. Not because I manipulated a dying woman. She left it to me because my voice caught sharply in my throat. I swallowed hard, forcing the emotion down into a tight box. Because she knew exactly what horrific lengths this family would go to once she was gone. I reached down and plunged my hand into my evening clutch. Before her heart stopped, Grandmother Eleanor left me a personal letter. I was far too terrified to open it until late last night. I pulled the crisp, folded envelope out into the open air. But I think it is long overdue that every single person in this room finally heard exactly what Eleanor had to say about her own daughter. Beatrice's face morphed from a sickly gray to a stark, terrified white. "Elara, do not do this," she pleaded. It was not a strict command this time. It was the desperate, pathetic plea of a cornered animal. But I was entirely done listening to her lies. "My dearest, brave Elara," I began reading loudly into the microphone, my voice steady and unyielding. "If you are reading these words while standing in front of a massive family gathering, it means that things have gone exactly as horrifically as I feared they would." The grand dining hall went absolutely, terrifyingly still. No one dared to breathe. And in the dark back corner of the room, the mysterious, gray-haired woman slowly stood up from her chair. I continued reading, letting Grandmother's ghostly words fill the oppressive silence. Beatrice has always, since she was a child, viewed other human beings merely as tools to be used and discarded. She aggressively tried to steal this mountain estate from me over a decade ago. She tried to legally convince the courts that I was suffering from dementia and was too frail to manage my own finances. When I fiercely fought back and successfully refused her, she completely stopped visiting me. She erased me. A loud, audible gasp erupted from the middle of the table. I believe it was Uncle Arthur's wife, Margaret. I knew with absolute certainty that Beatrice would eventually try the exact same vicious tactics with you. "My sweet girl," I read, my eyes scanning the shocked faces of the crowd. "She will weaponize your guilt. She will use the concept of family loyalty as a bludgeon. She will desperately try to make you feel microscopic and deeply selfish for simply wanting to keep what is rightfully, legally yours." I slowly lowered the paper and looked directly at my mother. Her hands were gripping the polished edge of the mahogany table with such extreme force that her knuckles were entirely white. "But you are absolutely not small, Elara," the letter continued. "You are not selfish. And the Silverwood estate is not merely a piece of valuable real estate. It is the absolute, undeniable physical proof that someone in this family truly loved you without any conditions." My voice wavered slightly, but I forced it to steady. "I have left you something else, too. Something far more dangerous. Something your mother has absolutely no idea exists. If you are reading this letter while completely surrounded by witnesses and knowing Beatrice's flair for cruelty, you probably are. Look around the room for your Aunt Josephine. She is my eldest daughter. She is the sister that Beatrice systematically erased from existence 20 long years ago." The entire obsidian room instantly erupted into chaotic, frantic whispers. "Beatrice has another sister? I never knew that. What is she talking about?" I raised my voice over the noise, reading the final paragraph. "Josephine has been patiently waiting for this day. She currently possesses the undeniable, concrete proof of absolutely everything Beatrice has done in the dark. Not just the abuse she inflicted upon you, but the abuse she inflicted upon me, upon Josephine, and upon anyone who ever dared to stand in the way of her greed." I slowly lowered the letter to my side and turned my head to look directly at the woman standing in the corner. She offered me a very small, incredibly sad smile. Beatrice had gone completely rigid, paralyzed like a deer caught in the headlights of an approaching semi-truck. "Hello, Beatrice," the woman called out. Her voice was strong, clear, and carried effortlessly across the massive room without the aid of a microphone. "It has been 20 long years since you threw me out. Did you miss your big sister?" My mother's mouth opened, but absolutely no sound emerged. I had an aunt. A living, breathing aunt. And she had been patiently waiting in exile for 2 decades for this exact moment of reckoning. Josephine slowly walked out of the shadows and stepped toward the massive mahogany table. The crowd of relatives physically parted for her like the Red Sea. She moved with the terrifying, absolute calm of a woman who had mentally rehearsed this confrontation 1,000 times in the dark. Every single footstep was measured. Every single breath was perfectly controlled. "Eleanor personally invited me to this dinner," Josephine announced, addressing the stunned room. Shortly before her lungs gave out, she called me and said, "When Beatrice finally makes her brutal move to break Elara, I need you to be standing in that room." You have absolutely no legal right to be in this building. My mother finally found her voice. It was a shrill, hysterical shriek that cracked in the middle. You were legally cut off from this family. You are a complete stranger. I was cut off from this family solely because I threatened to expose the horrifying truth to the authorities, Josephine stated calmly, stopping at the edge of the table, standing directly across from my mother. 20 years ago, I accidentally discovered exactly what you were secretly doing with Mother's massive investment accounts. You were actively skimming hundreds of thousands of dollars, aggressively forging her signature on bank transfers, and methodically isolating her from anyone who might notice the theft. The chaotic whispers in the room escalated into a dull roar. Uncle Arthur half stood from his chair, his face purple, then heavily collapsed back down in shock. Those are psychotic lies. My mother hissed, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at her sister. She has always been deeply jealous of my success. She is clinically insane. She is unstable. That is the exact narrative you aggressively peddled to everyone in this room. Josephine nodded slowly, completely unfazed by the attack. You told them all I was suffering from paranoid delusions. You claimed that Mother could never trust a word I said. Josephine slowly turned her body to face the massive audience of relatives. But Eleanor never, ever believed your lies. She just didn't possess the physical strength or the legal resources to wage a war against you back then. Josephine, that is enough. Julian's voice finally cut through the chaos, attempting to reassert his dominance. This is highly inappropriate. Whatever ancient grievances you hold against us, grievances, Josephine let out a soft, chilling laugh. Julian, do you honestly have any idea what your psychotic wife actually did? Or were you far too busy enjoying the stolen money to ask any questions? My father's heavy jaw snapped shut. He looked away, completely unable to meet her gaze. I did not travel across the country tonight to violently rehash ancient history, Josephine said, her voice dropping into a deadly serious register. I came here tonight strictly because my mother begged me to. Because Eleanor knew with absolute, terrifying certainty that Beatrice would eventually attempt to do to Elara exactly what she successfully did to me. And because, Josephine added quietly, reaching a hand deep into her heavy leather satchel, I brought the physical proof. Josephine extracted her smartphone from the bag and held it high in the air, exactly like a prosecutor presenting the murder weapon to a stunned jury. Exactly 3 months before her heart stopped, Eleanor assigned me one final, crucial task. Josephine's voice was unwavering, commanding the absolute silence of the room. She knew Beatrice would eventually make a ruthless power grab for Elara's assets. She just didn't know the exact date. My mother's face had drained from white to a translucent, horrifying shade of gray. Josephine, whatever fake garbage you think you have on that phone. 3 months before she died, Eleanor secretly allowed me to install a series of voice-activated, hidden audio recorders inside the primary living room of the Silverwood estate, Josephine stated loudly, completely cutting Beatrice off. Her dark eyes never left my mother's terrified face. She explicitly told me the exact location of the hidden drives. She explicitly told me to wait in the shadows until Beatrice arrogantly showed her hand. Josephine pressed the play button on her screen. The first voice that echoed through the high-definition speakers was my mother's. It was crystal clear, completely devoid of any background static. We will spring the trap at the grand birthday dinner. Maximum number of witnesses present. Maximum psychological pressure. My father's voice immediately followed. And what exactly is the protocol if she stubbornly refuses to sign the transfer documents? She will absolutely not refuse, my mother's recorded voice replied, oozing with confident, casual cruelty. She has always been the pathetic, weak link in this family. This operation will be incredibly easy. One massive, public shaming in front of the extended relatives, and she will immediately fold in on herself, exactly like she always does. Then, Vivian's voice joined the recording. What happens if she snaps and makes a humiliating public scene? Let her scream. My mother laughed on the tape. It was a cold, metallic sound. Having 56 respected witnesses actively watching her have a psychotic meltdown only significantly strengthens our legal case. We can immediately file motions claiming she is mentally unstable and successfully contest Eleanor's will on the grounds of incompetence. Josephine calmly pressed the pause button. The obsidian room was frozen in absolute, horrifying carbonite. I could clearly hear someone take a ragged, sharp intake of breath. Uncle Arthur had both of his large hands covering his mouth in pure shock. There are over 20 minutes of continuous audio on this file, Josephine stated quietly into the dead air. The recording details every single meticulous, cruel detail of tonight's psychological ambush. It includes exactly how you maliciously planned to use every single relative in this room. She gestured broadly to the stunned audience, as brainless props in your sick little theater production. That audio recording was obtained illegally without my explicit consent. My mother hissed violently, desperately grasping at useless legal straws. This is a single-party consent jurisdiction, Josephine replied, her voice remaining a calm, impenetrable fortress of logic. Mother was physically sitting in her own private residence when the recording was made. The audio is entirely admissible in any court of law in the state. The agonizing silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. Finally, Uncle Arthur spoke up, his voice heavy with profound disgust. "Beatrice, what in God's name have you done?" My mother, for the first time in her entire life, had absolutely no answer. Now, I know exactly what you might be wondering as you listen to this. Why did Josephine agree to help me? Why did she wait in absolute silence for 20 long years? The answer is incredibly simple and devastatingly profound. Sometimes, the only people who can truly reach into the dark and save us are the ones who were forced to walk the exact same agonizing path first. Josephine knew exactly, intimately, what it felt like to be systematically destroyed and erased by Beatrice. She was absolutely not going to stand by and watch history repeat itself with her niece. Have you ever been lucky enough to have someone like that unexpectedly step up for you in your life? Type yes in the comments if you have a guardian angel. And if you desperately want to see exactly how my arrogant mother reacted to being completely exposed to the light, stay with me. The absolute best, most satisfying part of this story is coming right now. The massive dining room was still violently reeling from the audio recording when I slowly raised the microphone back up to my mouth. I did not do it to viciously attack them. I did not do it to gloat. I did it because I needed to be absolutely, undeniably clear about the new reality. "Beatrice, Julian," I said, looking directly into their horrified eyes. "You dragged me here tonight to publicly disown me? Consider the transaction completed." My mother desperately opened her mouth to interrupt, but I completely overpowered her voice. "But this separation is absolutely not happening on your toxic terms," I continued, my voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "It is happening entirely on mine." I physically turned my body to face the massive room, addressing all 56 of the witnesses my parents had so carefully manipulated and assembled. "I will absolutely never sign that legal document. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. Not until the sun burns out." My voice was incredibly steady now, steadier and stronger than I had ever heard it in my entire life. The Silverwood estate was legally left to me by my grandmother. Her last will and testament is completely ironclad. Her intentions were thoroughly documented by multiple attorneys. I looked directly into the terrified eyes of Mr. Sterling, the ruthless corporate lawyer, still awkwardly clutching his useless brass notary stamp in the corner of the room. And just for the official legal record, I announced loudly, grandmother's will explicitly includes a highly aggressive protective clause. Any legal document regarding the estate that is signed under duress, coercion, or intimidation is automatically rendered void and inadmissible. I gestured broadly around the vaulted room. "Your 56 handpicked witnesses? They all just actively watched you attempt to violently coerce me on camera." I pointed a steady finger toward the dark, glass security dome mounted securely in the ceiling of the obsidian room. In a highly secure, private club equipped with high-definition audio and visual surveillance. Mr. Sterling's face went completely translucent. He very quietly, very rapidly slipped the heavy brass notary stamp back into his leather briefcase and clicked it shut. Furthermore, I continued relentlessly. That exact same protective clause clearly states that any blood family member who actively attempts to contest the will through illegal manipulation or coercion instantly and permanently forfeits their own remaining inheritance from the broader estate trust. I stopped speaking and let the absolute gravity of that statement sink deep into their bones. I stood there and watched my mother's jaw tighten so hard I thought her teeth would shatter. I watched my father's face completely drain of whatever color it had left. So, by all means, Beatrice, I challenged her, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. Hire the lawyers. Contest the will. Let's go to court and see exactly what assets you have left when the dust settles. Absolute, suffocating silence. Not a single person dared to move. And there is just one more thing, I said, slowly setting the heavy metal microphone down on the table with a soft, final thunk. I did absolutely nothing to bring shame to this family. What I brought was inconvenience. And there is a massive, fundamental difference between the two. I actively chose to live my own authentic life instead of performing like a trained circus monkey in your toxic illusion. That is not a criminal offense. It is called growing up and breaking the cycle. I looked down at Julian. He completely refused to look up from the tablecloth. I looked over at Vivian. She had her face buried in her hands, openly sobbing, though I could not tell if she was crying tears of genuine shame or simply mourning the massive influx of cash she was never going to receive. I am leaving this room now, I announced calmly to the crowd. Anyone who wishes to join me is more than welcome to follow. I turned my back on my parents and began walking toward the heavy oak doors, and I absolutely did not look back. I was exactly 3 steps away from freedom when my mother completely lost whatever fragile grip she had left on her sanity. This is utterly ridiculous. Her voice cracked through the air like a desperate, striking whip. Josephine has always been insanely jealous. She is a pathological liar. She manipulated that audio. She was never mentally stable. Beatrice. Uncle Arthur's deep, booming voice cut completely through her hysterical screaming. It was incredibly heavy, completely devoid of warmth, and saturated with profound disappointment. Stop talking. My mother violently wheeled around to face him, her eyes wide and manic. Arthur, you cannot possibly believe the lies she is spinning. We all just heard the high-definition recording, Beatrice. He shouted back, completely losing his temper. He slowly stood up, his heavy oak chair violently scraping against the polished marble floor. We all just sat here and listened to you meticulously planning to psychologically destroy and humiliate your own flesh and blood for a payout. You did it to fund Vivian's failing corporate career. You did it to protect your own fake, gilded image. You did it for yourself. Aunt Margaret immediately rose from her chair to stand shoulder to shoulder beside her husband. It has always been entirely about yourself, Beatrice, she said coldly. We were just all far too cowardly to admit what we were looking at. The massive dam finally, catastrophically broke. Voices suddenly erupted from every single corner of the U-shaped table. I cannot believe we flew across the country to participate in this sick ambush. Someone yelled. You lied to us for 20 years, claiming Josephine was locked in a psychiatric ward. Another cousin shouted. Poor Eleanor, a great-aunt wept softly. She must have known the absolute horror of what you were doing the entire time. My mother began physically spinning in tight circles, desperately trying to verbally address every single accusation, trying to plug the massive holes in her sinking ship. But the overwhelming waves of disgust kept violently crashing over her. Julian remained completely frozen in his chair, staring blankly down at his empty champagne flute as if it contained the magical answers to how his empire had collapsed in under 10 minutes. He did not attempt to defend his wife. He did not attempt to defend himself. He just sat there in pathetic, broken silence. Vivian still had her face buried in her hands, her expensive mascara running in thick black rivers down her cheeks. This was absolutely not supposed to happen. I heard her repeating in a frantic, broken whisper. This was not the plan. The grand plan failed miserably. Josephine's voice was incredibly gentle now, almost ringing with pity. They almost always fail eventually when the foundation is built entirely on cruelty. The relatives were all aggressively standing up now, frantically gathering their expensive coats and designer purses, practically sprinting toward the exit doors to escape the toxic fallout. "Where the hell are you all going?" my mother demanded, her voice rising to a frantic shriek. "We are not finished discussing this." But they were entirely finished with her. They were finished with the lies. "Elara." Her voice suddenly turned pathetic and desperate. "Elara, please wait. Do not walk out that door. We can sit down and talk about this." I stopped at the heavy oak doors, my hand resting on the cool brass handle. "No, Beatrice," I said quietly, without turning around. "We really, truly cannot." And I pushed the doors open and walked out. The crisp, freezing night air hit my flushed face like a physical blessing. It tasted incredibly cool, clean, and saturated with absolute freedom. I stood alone on the concrete sidewalk outside the obsidian room, my heart still pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, my hands still slightly trembling from the adrenaline crash. But as I stood there in the dark, I realized my face was stretching. I was smiling. I physically could not stop the expression from forming. I was actually genuinely smiling. "Elara, wait up." I quickly turned around. 3 distinct figures were rapidly hurrying out the heavy glass doors of the restaurant. They were young, flushed faces, filled with nervous energy. It was Clara, Leo, and Maya, my younger cousins. Clara reached me first, slightly out of breath from practically jogging in her heels. "Can we please come with you?" she asked, looking back over her shoulder nervously. I blinked in genuine surprise. "What?" "We absolutely do not want to stay in that toxic nightmare for another second," Leo said, aggressively jerking his thumb back toward the glowing windows of the club. "What your parents just tried to do to you, that was borderline sociopathic." Maya nodded her head so vigorously her hair whipped around her face. She was only 20 years old, the youngest of the trio. My own mother has spent my entire life constantly telling me I need to be a ruthless shark exactly like Vivian. She hesitated for a second, then squared her shoulders bravely. "But after watching tonight, I think I would much rather grow up to be exactly like you." Something deep inside the center of my chest completely cracked open. It was not the sharp, agonizing pain I was used to feeling when dealing with family. It was something significantly warmer. Something healing. "Are you guys absolutely sure about this?" I asked them gently. "Your parents are perfectly capable of making their own cowardly choices," Clara stated with absolute, fierce conviction. "And we are perfectly capable of making ours. We are coming with you." Behind them, I could see dozens more relatives frantically streaming out of the grand entrance of the obsidian room. Some immediately sprinted toward the valet stand, keeping their heads down, desperately wanting to escape the radioactive blast radius. Others stood in tight, panicked clusters on the sidewalk, whispering in low, urgent voices. And through the massive, tinted glass doors of the club, I could still clearly see my mother. She was standing completely alone in the center of the abandoned dining hall, her arms wrapped tightly around her own chest, violently shivering, watching her entire empire walk out the door. "You will deeply regret this." Her voice faintly carried through the thick glass, muffled but completely audible. "Every single one of you." Absolutely no one on the sidewalk turned around to look at her. "Come on," I said, turning to my 3 young cousins. "There is a fantastic, greasy 24-hour diner located about 2 blocks from here. I could desperately use a massive cup of terrible coffee. And a slice of cherry pie," Leo added enthusiastically. "Definitely a massive slice of pie." We began walking down the illuminated street together. The 4 of us. The foundational building blocks of a completely new, chosen kind of family. Far behind us, the heavy oak doors of the obsidian room swung violently shut, locking the past inside. That night, long after the diner, long after saying warm goodbyes to my cousins, I finally went home to my apartment alone. The physical space felt strangely different. It felt smaller somehow, but infinitely safer. I sat down heavily on the edge of my mattress in the dark, still wearing the deep forest green velvet gown, and finally allowed myself to physically feel the massive tidal wave of emotions I had been holding back for hours. I cried. I didn't cry the pretty, delicate, cinematic tears. It was the incredibly messy, ugly, violent, heaving kind of crying. The kind of physical release that only comes from spending 32 years holding your breath underwater and finally breaking the surface to drag oxygen into your lungs. My cell phone vibrated continuously on the nightstand. There were dozens of text messages from unknown numbers and a string of voicemails I absolutely could not bring myself to listen to. I vividly imagined my mother pacing her empty mansion, leaving increasingly frantic, unhinged audio messages, wildly alternating between vicious rage and fake, cloying sweetness. I reached over and permanently powered the device down. Plunged into absolute silence, I thought deeply about exactly what I had lost that evening. I had officially lost my parents. I had officially lost my sister. I had lost the agonizing, pathetic fantasy that if I just tried hard enough, if I contorted myself enough, they would eventually reward me with love. But that toxic fantasy had been slowly poisoning me to death for over 3 decades. It was finally time to let it die. I thought about the hollow, dead look on Julian's face when the audio recording echoed through the room. There was absolutely no shock in his eyes. No moral horror. Just pathetic resignation. He had known the entire time. He had always known exactly the kind of monstrous things my mother was capable of orchestrating. He had simply chosen the path of least resistance, choosing to look away and enjoy the spoils. I thought about Vivian violently crying into her manicured hands. She wasn't crying for my pain. She was crying for herself. She was mourning the massive financial bailout she was never going to receive. They had never, ever viewed me as a daughter or as a sister. I was merely a disposable resource. A frustrating problem. A pawn on their chessboard, exactly as grandmother Eleanor had warned me. But I was not a pawn anymore. I had flipped the entire board. I reached over and picked up grandmother Eleanor's fragile letter from where I had carefully placed it on the nightstand. I skipped to the very end and read the final, closing lines one more time. Do not spend your life mourning the loving family you inherently deserved, my sweet girl. Take that energy and fiercely build the family you actively choose. I carefully folded the ancient parchment and held it tightly against my chest. Okay, Eleanor, I whispered into the darkness. I absolutely will. The social and financial fallout from that night arrived significantly faster and far more brutally than I ever could have anticipated. Cousin Clara called me exactly 1 week later with a massive update, her voice practically vibrating with vindicated, righteous glee. Uncle Arthur and Aunt Margaret completely pulled their massive financial investment out of Vivian's corporate law firm venture yesterday morning, she reported excitedly. They explicitly told her senior partners that they absolutely could not trust the Vance family's ethical or financial judgment after witnessing what they tried to pull at the dinner. I leaned far back in my worn leather workshop chair, wiping oil from my hands. Wow, that is a massive blow. Oh, it gets infinitely better, Clara was practically giddy. 3 of Aunt Beatrice's wealthiest friends from the country club have completely stopped returning her phone calls. The horrifying story of the birthday ambush completely leaked. People in their social circles are actively referring to it as the Obsidian intervention. It is a massive, uncontrollable scandal. And it truly was a catastrophic scandal. My mother had spent her entire adult life meticulously building her fragile identity around being the flawless, respectable, universally admired matriarch. Now, the absolute darkest, ugliest truth of her soul was public knowledge. And what about your father? I asked carefully. He completely dropped out of the elite golf club on Tuesday. Clara's voice softened slightly. He sent a mass email claiming he was taking an extended period of time to mentally reflect on his priorities. I think that is just rich person code for being far too humiliated to show his face in public. Exactly 1 week after that conversation, Vivian managed to bypass my blocked numbers and call me from her office line. I almost didn't press the accept button. You completely ruined my entire life. Her voice was raw, broken, and completely devoid of its usual arrogant armor. My law firm is quietly forcing me to resign now that the capital fell through. I closed my eyes tightly. That is absolutely not my heavy burden to carry, Vivian. It never, ever was. It is a massive family burden. She shrieked desperately. No, I corrected her firmly. It was a massive Vivian burden that you violently attempted to force onto my shoulders through psychological torture. There is a massive difference. A long, heavy silence fell over the line, broken only by her ragged breathing. "I cannot believe you did this to your own blood," she finally whispered. "I did not do a single thing to you," I replied, keeping my voice incredibly steady and unyielding. "I simply refuse to allow you to do it to me anymore." She slammed the phone down without another word. I slowly set my phone down on the workbench and looked around my dusty, ticking studio. I looked at the fragile gears, the half-finished restorations, the quiet, peaceful life I had stubbornly built despite every single cruel thing they had ever said about me. The life I was finally entirely free to live. Aunt Josephine and I met for coffee on a heavily overcast, rainy Tuesday afternoon. She looked remarkably different in the natural daylight. Softer, less like a terrifying secret weapon deployed for destruction, and significantly more like exactly what she was, a profoundly tired woman who had spent 20 years dragging around a massive, heavy truth. "I owe you a massive explanation," she said softly, wrapping both of her hands tightly around the warm ceramic mug. "About exactly what happened 2 decades ago, and why I simply vanished into the wind." "I would very much like to hear it," I replied. She took a long, deep breath, staring out the cafe window at the rain. 20 years ago, I accidentally stumbled across a hidden box of receipts and falsified bank statements in your parents' home. Beatrice had been quietly, methodically siphoning massive amounts of cash from Mother's investment accounts for years. It started as small, untraceable amounts and then grew exponentially larger. When I finally cornered her and confronted her with the hard evidence, Josephine paused, a look of profound disgust crossing her features. She didn't even attempt to deny the theft. She just smiled that terrifying, empty smile of hers and whispered, "Who on earth is going to believe you over me?" I felt physically sick to my stomach. And nobody did? Nobody wanted to believe the ugly truth. Beatrice was the massively successful one. The wealthy one. The flawless golden child of the community. Josephine laughed. A harsh, bitter sound. "Does that dynamic sound painfully familiar to you?" "Vivian," I whispered. "It is history violently repeating itself." Josephine nodded grimly. When I aggressively threatened to take the physical evidence straight to the police, Beatrice initiated a massive whisper campaign. She told absolutely everyone in town that I was having a severe, psychotic breakdown. She claimed I was suffering from paranoid delusions. She even manipulated a corrupt family friend, a licensed psychiatrist, to officially suggest I needed to be committed for rest. By the time I could even attempt to legally defend my sanity, I was already permanently branded as the crazy sister. But Grandmother Eleanor knew the truth. Josephine's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Eleanor always knew the truth. She just simply did not possess the physical stamina or the financial resources to fight Beatrice in a massive legal war. So, she quietly planned. She patiently waited. She meticulously set the trap so that when Beatrice finally made her inevitable, greedy move to destroy you, I would be standing right there to drop the hammer. 20 years of waiting in absolute silence, I murmured in awe. That is an unimaginably long time. It was agonizing. Josephine reached across the small table and squeezed my hand tightly. "But you were absolutely worth the wait, Elara. Mother knew you were worth it. And after watching you take command of that room, now I know exactly why." We sat together in comfortable, healing silence, watching the heavy rain streak down the cafe windows. "Beatrice does not actually hate you, Elara," Josephine finally said quietly. "She is absolutely terrified of you. Because you are the single, solitary thing in this entire world that she could never, ever control." I let that massive, profound truth settle deep into my bones. Exactly 1 month later, I stood alone on the massive wooden wraparound deck of the Silverwood estate, quietly watching the sun violently set over the jagged mountain peaks. The massive chalet was exactly as Grandmother Eleanor had left it. Faded floral curtains, towering antique grandfather clocks in every corner, mismatched brass tools scattered across the workshop tables. Some of the tools were hers, some were mine. All of them were utilized with profound love. The air smelled strongly of sharp pine needles, old wood polish, and something completely indefinable that just felt exactly like her spirit. I had driven up to the estate 3 times since the catastrophic dinner. Each time I walked through the door, the residual pain hurt just a fraction less. This time, it finally, truly felt like I was coming home. I had officially started teaching introductory clock restoration classes on the weekends. It was nothing fancy or formal. Just a long folding table set up on the deck, a few portable magnifying lamps, and whoever possessed the patience to learn. Cousin Clara enthusiastically attended the very first session. Maya showed up for the second. Leo randomly appeared last week, looking incredibly sheepish, claiming he was just vaguely curious about how gears worked. Aunt Josephine drove up every single Sunday for a massive family dinner. We were slowly, carefully building something incredibly beautiful that neither of us had ever expected to have, a family. It was small. It was deeply imperfect. But it was entirely chosen. My cell phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a text message from Clara. Maya desperately wants to know if you are hosting a workshop class tomorrow morning. She is bringing a friend from college who wants to learn. I smiled broadly and rapidly typed back, "There is always plenty of room at the table for more." I leaned heavily against the cold wooden deck railing and thought deeply about grandmother Eleanor. I pictured her standing in this exact spot, watching the exact same mountain sunset, making the exact same quiet choice every single day to fiercely hold on to the things that actually mattered in this world. She had given me so much more than a multi-million-dollar piece of real estate. She had handed me the undeniable proof that genuine love did not have to be painfully earned through blind obedience. She proved that true belonging did not require completely erasing yourself. "Thank you," I whispered softly into the freezing mountain wind. The wind rushed through the pine branches below, steady, ancient, and eternal. Somewhere far down in the city, my parents were undoubtedly still frantically spinning their pathetic web of stories, desperately trying to rewrite history and pretending to everyone that they were the tragic victims. But I was absolutely no longer listening to their static. I had broken clocks to fix, eager students to teach, and a massive, beautiful life to live. And for the very first time in 32 years, I was standing exactly where I belonged. The final phone call arrived early on a crisp Thursday morning. I was meticulously polishing the brass face of an 18th century mantel clock when my phone illuminated with a contact name I had already blocked twice before. Mother. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the screen. Then, for reasons I will honestly never fully understand, I pressed the green button and accepted the call. Elara. Her voice sounded entirely different. It was incredibly quiet, stripped of its usual booming authority, but the razor-sharp edge was still hiding just beneath the surface. My father is currently sitting with the lawyers, reconsidering his final will and testament. No hesitant hello. No asking how I was doing. Just cutting straight to the only leverage they understood. Money. I see, I replied simply, continuing to buff the brass plate. If you agree to publicly apologize to the family and sign over the legal rights to the Silverwood estate, we might seriously reconsider reinstating your proper place in this family, she offered, her voice tight with desperation. I slowly set down my polishing cloth and looked out the massive workshop window at the towering mountains. Beatrice, I said, speaking incredibly slowly, ensuring she heard every single syllable. I am only going to say this to you one time. I want you to listen very closely. I absolutely do not need a single cent of your money. I already possess everything I could ever need. I do not crave your hollow approval. I have finally learned how to live beautifully without it. And I absolutely do not want a place in any family that treats human love like a hostile corporate transaction. A massive, heavy silence fell over the cellular line. You will deeply regret this catastrophic decision, she finally hissed, the venom returning to her voice. When you are old and pathetic and utterly alone, I am not alone. Beatrice, I interrupted her calmly. I thought of Josephine, Clara, Leo, Maya, and the passionate students who arrived every weekend to learn my trade. I have a family. A real, loving family. They just absolutely refuse to share your toxic last name. I could clearly hear her ragged, furious breathing through the speaker. But, Beatrice, I paused, genuinely surprised by the words that were about to leave my mouth. If you ever, someday, genuinely want to have a real relationship with me, one based entirely on honesty, without demanding control or blind obedience, my door will remain unlocked. Those are my absolute final terms. The suffocating silence stretched out for 10 full seconds. "Goodbye, Elara," she finally whispered, and the line clicked dead. I stared down at the dark screen of my phone for a very long moment. Then I set the device down, picked up my brass polishing cloth, and went back to work on my beautiful clock. She never attempted to call me again. I kept my door unlocked anyway. Not because I actually expected her to ever walk through it, but because I absolutely refused to let her bitterness turn me into a monster like her. Some boundaries in life are massive, impenetrable brick walls. Other boundaries are open invitations for growth. I proudly chose the second option. So, that is my entire story. On the exact night of my 32nd birthday, the people who raised me attempted to publicly execute me in front of 56 relatives. They honestly believed that public shame would force me to shrink into nothingness. They arrogantly believed that psychological pressure would easily shatter my spine. They were catastrophically wrong. If you are watching this video right now and you tragically recognize the shadow of your own family in mine, I am so incredibly sorry. I am so profoundly sorry that you know exactly what this suffocating pain feels like. The agonizing, constant second-guessing of your own reality. The desperate, starving hunger for parental approval that is never, ever going to come. The horrifying way you constantly twist and contort your personality into smaller and smaller boxes, praying that maybe this time, this muted version of yourself will finally be deemed enough. It will never be enough. Because the fundamental problem was never ever you. I desperately need you to know something right now. You are absolutely allowed to set ironclad boundaries. You are absolutely allowed to stand up and walk away from the table. You have the absolute right to choose exactly who deserves to occupy space in your life and who deserves to be locked out. Sharing blood does not automatically equal family. Sharing a painful history does not automatically equal genuine love. And remaining completely silent while people repeatedly abuse you is not loyalty. It is self-destruction. My 32nd birthday was meticulously designed to be the absolute lowest, most humiliating moment of my entire life. Instead, it became the glorious turning point of my existence. It was the exact night I finally stopped asking for permission to simply exist. It was the night I truly learned that the toxic people who try the hardest to make you feel microscopic are almost always the ones who are absolutely terrified of how massive you will become when you finally break free. A little over a month later, I am standing in my grandmother's mountain estate, actively building a beautiful life that she would have been incredibly proud to witness. I am teaching, I am creating, and I am finally learning exactly how to take up massive amounts of space in this world without apologizing for it. It is absolutely not easy. Some days, the residual trauma still hurts like a physical wound. But I would never, ever trade the sharpness of this pain for the suffocating, hollow numbness of my old life. Not for all the money in the world. They desperately wanted to make me feel small. Instead, they accidentally showed me exactly how massive I needed to become to crush them. And that, I truly believe, is the absolute greatest revenge of all. A beautiful, peaceful life, lived entirely on your own terms. Thank you so much for being here and walking this long journey with me. If this story touched something deep inside your chest, please type boundaries in the comments below. Because that is the absolute most vital lesson I have learned. And if you want to hear more empowering stories about standing up to the darkness and fighting for yourself, hit the subscribe button and turn on your notifications so you never miss a single one. Be sure to check the description box for more stories exactly like this one. I will see you all in the next video. And please, always remember, you inherently deserve to be surrounded by people who love you without any conditions. Take excellent care of yourselves.